watching Shalom TV, celebrating Jewish culture. Funding for Shalom TV has been provided by the following. And by viewers like you.
Jewish Education in Media is pleased to present LChayim, a program that highlights the people, issues, and events of importance to the Jewish community. Now here is your host, Rabbi Mark Golub.
AIPAC, the American Israel Public Affairs Committee, which lobbies the American government on behalf of American Jewish support for the State of Israel, recently concluded its annual policy conference in Washington, D.C., much of which you can see now on Shalom TV. The overriding one-word theme of this year's conference was Iran, and the worry American Jewry has that Iran will be permitted to develop a nuclear weapon which it will use against the State of Israel and the entire Western world. Now everyone seemed to be at AIPAC this year, including the Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, the President of Israel Shimon Peres, and so were major figures on the American political scene, beginning with the President of the United States, Barack Obama, Republican and Democratic leaders Senator Mitch McConnell and Democratic House Leader Nancy Pelosi, the Secretary of Defense Leon Panetta, and the three major Republican candidates running for the Republican presidential nomination, Mitt Romney, Rick Santorum, and Newt Gingrich. And the question that was central at AIPAC this year was, where should the red line be drawn which would trigger military action against Iran to prevent it from developing nuclear weapons? And to many of the record number 13,000 participants at AIPAC this year, there was a subtle but serious difference in philosophy and preferred policy between Prime Minister Netanyahu and President Obama. For Mr. Netanyahu, the red line should be drawn to prevent Iran from acquiring the capability of developing a nuclear weapon. For President Obama, the red line is drawn to stop Iran from building a nuclear weapon. Capability versus building. Well, just how significant is this difference between the President and the Prime Minister? And where should the red line be drawn? For some answers, we're joined by an outstanding panel of Jewish leaders, including Ken Jacobson, Deputy National Director of the Anti-Defamation League and the ADL's past Director of International Affairs. Marcie Natan, the National President of Hadassah, the International Women's Zionist Organization. Kenneth Bialkin, who spent a lifetime of service to the Jewish community, is a past chairman of the President's Conference and is the current chairman of the America-Israel Friendship League. And one of American Jewry's foremost rabbinic leaders, Rabbi Joseph Potasnik, Executive Vice President of the New York Board of Rabbis, chaplain to the New York City Fire Department, and host of his own program seen here on Shalom TV, Faith to Faith. Here then, from B'nai Zion headquarters in Manhattan, is our LChayim Roundtable on Shalom TV. I thank all four of you so much for joining me again. It's wonderful to sit with you, just wonderful. I just want to throw the question up in the air, and I want you to begin. As you have seen what evolved out of AIPAC, and you hear how the issues have been delineated, is it your sense that there is a serious or minor difference in policy and approach between President Obama and Prime Minister Netanyahu?
I think there's clearly a difference. It's been well commented on. To be simple, Netanyahu wants it understood that Israel is its own determinant of when and whether and how it will protect itself, and doesn't want to have to be indebted to anybody for permission. Obama has agreed that Israel is a sovereign country and can decide and should decide for itself, and has said many things to that effect to support the notion that he stands strongly with Israel. However, the comments coming out of other parts of the government, and indeed from the president himself as recently as yesterday and the day before, have cast some doubt on whether they're congruent, that is, exactly fitting, or whether there's a little gap between them. And the gap seems to be that the president insists that it's a better policy to let diplomacy work until it's exhausted its opportunity before the issue of force becomes relevant. And the Israelis seem to say that diplomacy hasn't worked. Look at it for the last 5 or 6 years. It hasn't slowed down the Iranians from moving forward. There's no real reason to think that it can work, given the fact that Russia and India and China and other people are not part of the sanctioned world to a full extent. And so the economic capsule isn't sound. And so there's no real reason to expect that sanctions will work. And Israel should not be hampered in when it decides whether it's capability or assembly. That's not the relevant issue. The relevant issue is whether or not, to me, there is or is not an ambiguity. And why do I put it that ambiguity is the problem? If it were clear to the world that the United States would back with force and military effort whatever the point is, when Iran achieves nuclear capability, if the United States were sure to do it, and the Iranians believed it, then the Iranians might yield. But until it is clear to the Iranians, and only to the Iranians, that they're facing the prospect of military force, why should they stop until they've reached it? And that's the ambiguity.
I understand. I want to make sure now I understand your own position. Do you side with the president who wants to continue diplomacy, or do you feel diplomacy has been exhausted?
I think that everybody has to look carefully to the extent that their intelligence and other surveillance can tell them what is the state of facts on the ground. Where is Iran? How capable are they? If they're 5 years away and they're not close to solving the problem, then diplomacy should be able to work for 4.5 years. If, on the other hand, they come to the point where all they have to do is open a drawer or throw a toggle switch or do something to produce an operable device, then it's almost too late by then to intercede, depending on how you decide to intercede.
Joe, do you feel it's still time for diplomacy, or do you feel diplomacy has passed its time?
My understanding is that both sides are willing to give diplomacy every possible opportunity to succeed. They may differ as to how long one can pursue diplomacy, but look, no one wants to go to war. No reasonable person wants to go to war. No one wants to lose members of the family. I think Israel has suffered greatly over the years because it went to war and had to go to war. So, of course, diplomacy. But the question becomes, at what point do we say it can no longer work? And I think one of the things we also realize, and that's why it was important to hear about sovereignty. Golda Meir said years ago, we live in a tough neighborhood. By the time you'll get here, we won't be here. And I think Israel recognizes that assurances are reassuring, but ultimately you have to protect the welfare of your people. So it would be nice to be on the same line, of the same page. I think presently we're in the same page. I don't think we're exactly on the same line, but I think Israel knows, as it knew with the reactor years ago in Iraq, that this is something that threatens us directly, and we have to do something about it. I also would hope that in this discussion, not just here but around the world, people don't see this solely as an Israeli problem. I think for too long this has been portrayed as this is Israel that wants this conflict, that wants this confrontation. And I remember Netanyahu said years ago, if the world were serious about stopping terrorism, the world could have stopped it. If there had been a real collective approach and people were committed to making a difference, we wouldn't be at this point today. But for too long, there were those who allowed commercial interest to intervene, who felt, let Israel take care of it, it's not our issue. And I think we're beginning to realize, as we should, that what happens to Israel could happen to anyone else, and we better become more stringent, more severe in the application of sanctions. So I would hope that takes place.
But the president did make very clear at AIPAC that this is an American issue, and that was welcomed by everyone there. I'm sorry, I want to press you one more time. At this point in time, do you have, maybe the answer is no one at this table knows, but do you have a feeling here? At AIPAC, people had a feeling. Right. At the moment, do you have a feeling whether diplomacy has run its course or whether there should be a serious extension of the diplomatic process? I'm
always nervous when people who live outside an area make military decisions about what should govern an area. I don't think any of us have entree to top secret information. I think conceptually, if there is an opportunity to strengthen the sanctions, let's do it. If there isn't, then the other choice must be made. And I think both the President and the Prime Minister of Israel agree that if sanctions don't work, military option has to take place. When that happens, that's where there may be some disagreement here.
Okay. Marcie, do you have a feeling yourself at the moment about, when you talk to people, who are involved in Hadassah and also are in Israel, any sense you have at the moment whether the feeling is, yes, we still should let sanctions work, or whether the sanctions have played themselves out?
The beauty of heading an organization of over 300,000 is we have 600,000 opinions. I think that by and large, though, representing Hadassah, I can say two things. First, that we, like everybody else, would like to let sanctions play out for as long as they can. But when the state of Israel decides the time has come to act, we need to be there, ready to support and defend whatever action that government takes. And I think, Rabbi, you said it well, that they are a sovereign nation and they need to be allowed to do whatever it is to protect their country, their citizens, all of their citizens. And Hadassah will be there with them and support their decisions.
Okay. Ken?
Well, first of all, I think it's important to say, at least in my view, that the president moved quite a bit in the last few days. I'm talking about his interview with Jeffrey Goldberg in The Atlantic and then his speech to AIPAC on several fronts, some of which have been alluded to. He emphasized, as you pointed out, that this was not an Israeli issue alone. It's a world interest, and he delineated explicitly why. He talked about nuclear proliferation. He talked about terrorism. He raised all the issues, making it clear this is an issue for the United States and for the entire civilized world. That was a very, very important step that he talked about. He talked about other things. He talked about Israel. He did say that Israel has the right, the sovereign right, and he understands it, to protect its own interests. Those are things that were not said before. So the president came forward on including the fact that he specifically said, I am not for containment. This is one of the most important issues around. I remember a meeting with the French foreign minister 6 or 7 years ago in the fall during the General Assembly, where at one point in the conversation he said, we may have to learn to live with an Iranian bomb.
Which is what containment means.
Which is containment means. And of course the argument is we did it with the Soviet Union. The president very clearly said containment is not the option that I am pursuing. So first, I think it's important to understand that. I think the president came away, and I think the prime minister helped to move him along in those directions. The problem in terms of a gap, it seems to me, is where each party sits. Israel sits in the Middle East where it perceives Iran to be an existential threat. The United States is the superpower of the world. We sit here, we do have strategic interests, but it's a very different perspective, and everything is seen through these different lenses. So I will disagree, Ken, with one point. I agree with just about everything else you said. I do think the difference between the capability issue and the actual weapon issue is actually crucial to these discussions. Because from the Israeli perspective, the credibility of the president's commitment on whether or not to pursue prevention or containment really depends from their point of view as to whether the United States believes it's the capability or the weaponry. Because just as was said, if it's the weaponry and they get to the point where they have all the enriched uranium, it could happen so secretly and so quickly, as it did in North Korea, that they could have a weapons capability overnight, and then the calculus changes for the United States. After all, let's remember, the main reason Iran is developing a nuclear weapon, in my view, is survival of the regime. And they see 3 examples around the world. They see Iraq and Libya that either never developed a weapon or gave it up, and they're both gone. And they see North Korea, which has a weapon and is surviving. And for them, developing that weapon is so critical. And so once they have the capability, I have to believe the Israelis think they're going to try to do it so quickly. And then once they have it, they don't really have trust that the United States has nothing to do with how good a guy Obama is or not. It has to do from a different perspective that they're coming from. And so therefore, for the Israelis, the time frame, I believe, is actually dramatically shrinking. I know Israeli representatives, I've been on platforms, we all have been over 6, 7 years, where Israelis would say, this is the year of decision, and they lost credibility by it. I happen to believe it's different now, and I do believe that that issue of the timing becomes critical. So I think there was progress made. I think there are good reasons for people who care about Israel to think that what took place overall is a good thing. But I too express a concern about the president's comments in his press conference the day after, in which he went out of his way, because he was reacting to the Republicans who were maybe playing political games, but he went out of his way to say, in effect, and the Israelis have to realize there'll be consequences if they act prematurely for Americans. And that part undermines some of his earlier statements. Because I could have said, look, if I were president at that moment, I would have said, look, there are consequences for America, but you know what? If Israel decides it has to protect itself, and succeeds, not only will it benefit Israel, it'll benefit the whole world. We will get the benefit of a strong, successful, which he did not do. So it was unfortunate that he said that after the fact, but I will say that overall, the gaps exist not because Obama is pro-Israel or not pro-Israel, because America and Israel sit in very different situations, and we have to realize that's a reality, and it comes back to ultimately what everyone else said. In the end, Israel's going to have to decide. If it believes it's not moving fast enough to stop Iran, they may have to take a decision. We all would like it to be peaceful, and we all would like sanctions to work and to increase sanctions as soon as possible.
I agree with Ken. I would just add to that equation in Iran, the religious fervor. They see it, I believe, in their eyes, this apocalyptic vision at the end of days, and by hastening nuclear acquisition, they're bringing about the Mahdi. There is this kind of ideology that I think also furthers it. The other thing is consistency and the lack thereof. The president will say, he'll speak clearly at AIPAC, all the applause lines are there. The day after, 2 days after, there is a change already in some of the kind of support, a little bit of a dilution. The Secretary of State in Tunisia when asked about support for Israel being so strong, she said, look, you have to understand it's a political year. That doesn't help when you have representatives of this administration saying, Iran is not the serious threat that other people say. You're getting mixed messages. And I think that is part of the overall problem.
But to his credit, particularly, I would recommend to everyone to read the interview with Jeffrey Goldberg. He really went much further and clearer on these variety of issues.
2 days later, there was a little bit of backtracking.
A little bit.
So, all right, so, you want consistency and you don't get it.
By the way, I spoke to Jeffrey at AIPAC, and again, it's on Shalom TV. He was not as impressed by the piece as everybody else seemed to be impressed. He wasn't downplaying it, but he seemed to think it said less new things than people were saying to other people at AIPAC it was saying. So that I'm not sure I'm not sure it was as revelatory as we would like
But
it to be.
again, the president never said before, we will not pursue a policy of containment. That was very important.
Yes.
He never said so explicitly, this is an American interest. Those are important. He
That's
never
right.
said so explicitly that Israel has the sovereign right. If we set standards for what we expect and the president does it, we ought to give him credit for doing it. And I agree with you, though, when he seems to backtrack a little, or at least undermine it, we should also say that I believe the relationship with the United States for Israel is too important. We don't have the luxury to engage in this assumption about whether someone is a good guy or not a good guy. We have to react to our honest evaluation in
By
each
what
case,
he does.
and to commend
By what
him when he does
by what
things
he
that are
does, not just by what
positive
he-
and do that.
Richard Nixon was notoriously anti-Semitic. Tapes showed he was and yet his performance. You mentioned Nixon in Israel, and they'll say he was a savior. So we judge people, even in Jewish tradition. It's what you do, not necessarily by what you say.
Except that sometimes what you saying is doing.
That's correct.
For example, the president himself said as recently as yesterday or the day before, one shouldn't listen to what people say. One should look at what people do. But then he says, and his proxies say even strongly, we don't believe that you should have too sensitive a trigger finger. We believe that you should wait until you're sure that they're on the ground before you take action. And that's why...
And that's what they're doing.
That's why I stand on my objection to the concept of capability versus achievement, as you put. Because it's, as Ken explained, different people can look at it differently. Capability to achievement can be judged in terms of minutes or years, yards or inches. It should be in the judgment of the viewer as to what they feel is the danger to them, as well as the opportunities that are presented to deal with that danger.
Okay,
For example, I just want to make one
I want to
more
make sure the
point.
audience follows this. What I understood the president, the debate to be, if certain things have to be assembled, before you can assemble them, you have to have all the pieces together. And what Prime Minister Netanyahu seemed to be saying is, I don't want to wait till all the pieces are in place and now we begin to build a bomb. And the president seemed to be saying, until I know the pieces are in place, I'm not going to take action. And the prime minister was saying, I don't want to wait that long.
No, I think he didn't even say that. It seems that I would say that with the pieces in place, let's focus on enriched uranium. Okay, that's the pieces in place. My understanding of the American position is that it's not only enriched uranium, they have to begin the process of building the weapon itself before that red line
America
is
would
crossed.
take action.
That's right.
And Netanyahu does
So
not want
he's
to
saying
wait that long.
once you've already enriched uranium sufficiently, it'll take no time, and they could do it secretly,
Right.
and that's the big difference.
And
If-
at what point would you want action to take place?
If what the president says is what he means, what he says is Israel is a sovereign country and they're free to defend their own interests as they see it, then he has to accept a judgment that they make, if they make it, that the threat to them and the risk they face, measured by the opportunities they see, says the time is now even though somebody else may say, well, you don't have all the ingredients of the cake in the pot yet. Wait till the ingredients are there before you put it into the stove. And someone can say, I don't want to have to wait.
It has to do with the word
Correct.
prematurely.
And so that debate is meaningless.
But why is it meaningless?
No, but the
The way you
president,
define it, it seems to me to be very meaningful. I don't want to wait until it's all in the pot, says Netanyahu. And you seem to be saying the same thing, that you don't want to wait that long either. And you're also
But
saying the president...
I don't think a word, capability or achievement, has much meaning. Those are scientific terms. I think you have to make judgments based on the gestalt, based on the entirety of what you see. And if the president is to be credited, and I think he should be for what he said, then if he meant what he said, then Israel has to have a little slack in making a judgment as to how bad they think the danger is at a particular moment. And I don't think any of us, certainly sitting at the table, can do it, or anybody
Okay, I wanna
else,
ask you-
unless you have all the information.
Okay, I want to ask you
agree
one
with
more
that.
question. If the prime minister and Bowie, he will not make this decision alone. I understand it is a major cabinet decision that has to be made, and there are 14 people who are involved in this decision, and it will not be made by one or two individuals. But if the state of Israel decides that it can't wait any longer, do you believe if Israel did take action, America would support Israel?
That's a good question. I do think they would. I think everything in our DNA, everything in our history, everything in the arrangement, if Israel, for example, I think it more likely that if Israel does something, it will not be a full-bore bombing alone without the Americans, because why would Israel want to strip its arsenal of every plane, of every missile, of everything they have, knowing that there's going to be a retaliation of some kind, if not from the Iranians, from all of their proxies around the world? You always have to look at the second step. And I think the United States has signaled and should signal that if Israel does take a step and it doesn't accomplish it all at once, the United States is going to have to be there to back Israel's judgment, which the United States has said we will respect, especially since it's congruent with the objectives we have, namely, which is to rid the world of an Iranian bomb.
Okay, does everybody agree with Ken, or
Well,
is there a difference?
maybe not.
opinion?
well, I think a lot. I respect the president's comment. I think it was important that he said that Israel has the sovereign right to defend its interests. I believe he means it, and I think it's serious. But he also used the word in this press conference about not attacking prematurely, and that gets into the question,
So
what
maybe
is
he doesn't believe it so much
that-
if he's
well, that's-
making that warning.
that's right.
So
That's-
why should you be so sure
Well,
he
no.
means it?
Well,
I mean,
I take
maybe
him
he
at
does.
I take him at his words, but I think it does undermine it. I think it undermines it because the question is, who's making the judgment about when it's premature? That's the thing. And by saying, in effect, not only saying premature, but linking it to Americans could be harmed, he in effect is saying to Israel, look, when you make your decision, you should be thinking on the impact about the impact on Americans. Now, first of all, as I said earlier, I believe he should have been stating it in a more positive way, which is if Israel succeeds, they could actually have a very positive impact on American interests, which I would have liked him to say. But there still can be a distinction. If the president believes, and he's entitled to believe this, that there's still a possibility of stopping Iran before you go to military action through increased sanction. By the way, we've been calling for the president to move on sanctions. The next sanctions are supposed to be in July. He has to do it now and has to push it now if there's any chance of getting something going. Plus diplomacy, if it could work. I could understand. The problem is that Israel's timeline, in my view, seems to be quite different from the United States timeline. And again, it
I don't know
has
if
to
it's
do
quite
with
different. I think it's different. Whether it's quite different is a matter of discussion. But it's also an election year. And you add an election year to all of that which is going on. And that also...
Many people at AIPAC raised that point.
Right.
And do you think that will prevent or encourage the president to take action or not? The fact that it's an election year.
I think you have a Congress that strongly supports Israel. We've had all kinds of statements from the Republican candidates, strongly. Mitch McConnell
comes out and
right.
says, I'm going to
introduce a resolution. Right.
We should go to war.
You know, and look, I think we've learned when it comes to, again, Israeli sovereignty, Israeli protection, Israel will do what it feels it is compelled to do. I don't want people to think that Israel has this kind of haphazard or, this whatever approach. If they're convinced that this is the last minute for them, I don't think they'll hope for it imprimatur from the president, but I don't think the lack of the imprimatur will stop them from pursuing what has to be done.
Do you tend to believe the president here?
Careful.
I think you said something earlier about there's, what you do and
what
you say. And I keep looking at the fact that we say we're going to go in, we need to know how far along Iran is, and yet we go in and they say, well, you can't go here and you can't go there, and we say, okay, we'll sit wherever you tell us to sit. So in my mind, that message is
That's what I was trying to imply.
not quite the level of assurance that I would like to see, not only for Israel, but because I see Iran as a threat, a world threat. The president has never been to Israel. Now,
Since becoming president.
But that's the role where people are looking to say, okay, where do you stand? And he talks the talk. In my mind, 24 hours in the country would say so much more than a lot of the
Especially after you've been to Cairo. Especially after you've gone to
Especially
Cairo.
But
if
to
you
be
go to
fair,
Cairo.
to the president, Ronald Reagan was one of Israel's best friends. He never visited. George Bush did not visit till his 7th year of his presidency. If that were the sole criterion, I think there would, look, I think many of us, I surely have had major issues with the president, particularly in the first 2 years in office. But as he's been pointing out, he has a record of accomplishment as well that I think we need to recognize and speak about, whether it's the tight security, military relationship, whether it's standing up, whether on the Goldstone report or at the UN against the unilateral initiative, or whether it was the rescuing Israeli security people in the I mean, there are a lot of things that have been done that at least we should give credit for. That doesn't mean you don't have.
I don't think
you don't
anybody
have
wants to take
questions.
away the credit. I think what we're saying is he certainly has dramatically reached out, right, to the Muslim world. That's been very clear. There's been an effort, not criticizing the effort, there's been an outreach. And I think what some are saying is, yes, you have made statements that are favorable to Israel, but given the extent to which you have extended your arm to others, at least come to see us. You're right, you're in the area, at least come to visit. I don't think that's an unreasonable,
I wish he
I know it's an unreasonable request.
don't get me wrong, I think he's made a mistake by not visiting Israel, but I wouldn't use as the sole criterion for analyzing whether the president's been a friend. He's done a lot of things.
Right,
I think it's a mistake.
Right, and as I think the settlement statement was a mistake, right, as the
He's
boundaries
made
was a
mistake.
mistake. These things
Again,
are
as I
troubling.
said
That's-
earlier, I think
Well,
we need
those
to keep a
mistakes-
balance.
Those mistakes reflect a mindset, an attitude, a policy, a predilection, a view. You brought it up yourself. Go back to Cairo in '09. In his Cairo speech, when he changed U.S. policy from the Bush administration, which was to favor Israel in the Palestinian negotiations, he said, it's time that we build our relationship with the Arab world, and therefore, from now on, our view of the narrative is going to support the Palestinians. He didn't put
No,
it.
he didn't.
He didn't put it in
Let's-
those words, but from
Well,
that
he
moment
said he was
forward,
going to be more even-handed.
from that moment forward, he came down and said, no more building in Jerusalem, no more settlements, 67 borders with mutually agreed adjustments, and he's changed every one of those. In the September 21 speech that he made
At the United Nations?
at the evening in the United Nations, in the middle of the speech, which was dealing with the Arab Spring subject, wasn't dealing with the Palestinians at all. He reverted to the Palestinian issue. And he said then, and never before, and none of his other people have said since, he said, as to the Palestinian issue, I believe, as president, the parties, the Palestinians and the Israel, should sit down face to face, negotiate with each other, and decide on the big major issues: borders, Jerusalem, settlements, right of return. And they should decide, and not us. And in those few words, he altered every bit of the, I would say, the bullishness of trying to push the Israelis
but we have to, good, I'm
and
glad
so
you
he
recognize it.
changed that policy.
And you liked that speech very much.
No, I think what
I
Ken is-
wrote that his speech was an inspiring speech. It was the speech that caused Ed Koch that day to reverse his own position, which had been to abandon the president. He took the Wiener election, the Wiener by-election in Queens, as a referendum on Obama.
But I don't
and he then said Obama failed until he made that speech. And now we have to see whether that
No, but I
new
think what
policy
Ken has said very
is
simply.
preserved.
We're ready to fault him for what he does wrong. Let's also
And-
credit
and
him for
also-
what he does right.
And I
That was
think
a
we,
good
I think
thing.
we get diverted if we're going to personalize this, because I think the issues, both the coordination on the one hand and whatever gap exists, are issues that, in my view, go beyond personalities. Whatever the issues are between Obama and Netanyahu, again, I think the United States sits in a very different position when it views these issues, and I think Israel sits in a very different
Well,
position.
I'd like to
AIPAC
agree with Ken on this point. It makes no difference to me whether a president likes or doesn't like
We all agree.
Israel,
Absolutely right.
whether he's friendly, whether he's not friendly.
We want the policy.
It's what he does
Especially
and
the
how he
critical
implements
Okay.
our
Okay.
policies.
At AIPAC, there was this overwhelming sentiment that there was a real concern that there was a gap, a large gap, between the way Israel sees this problem and the way the administration sees this problem. There were many wonderful things that Obama said when he spoke to AIPAC, just wonderful. But it was clear that Netanyahu then came, and remember, Obama spoke the first night of AIPAC, Netanyahu spoke the last night of AIPAC. And the people there, and when you heard the response, and what evoked overwhelming applause, what evoked standing ovations, there was a feeling that Netanyahu was calling for action relatively soon, and that he felt Israel did not have a lot of time. And the president had talked about implementing sanctions that he wouldn't begin to implement until July.
Which is a problem.
All right? And Netanyahu is basically telling this room, we can't wait. And he also was dramatic in trying to show how the sanctions have not worked. And as we sit here today, there were two editorials written by two of the major columnists on the American scene, Bret Stephens in the Wall Street Journal and Thomas Friedman in the New York Times, as we're sitting here. And Bret Stephens asks the question, and he was at AIPAC, after you heard President Obama at AIPAC, is he to be believed? And what Bret Stephens says is, in one word, no. And then he writes a long piece in which he tries to show all the reasons why the president should not be believed based on policy decisions that he has made and things that other people in his administration, which you mentioned earlier, have also said, that even while he says that Israel should be free to act as it sees fit, national security advisors are warning Israel not to attack Iran. And that while Obama takes credit, Stephen says, for the sanctions, especially those dealing with the Iranian National Bank, those sanctions had to be forced down Obama's throat, which he now takes as if this was an administration policy that he initiated. At the same time, Thomas Friedman writes a piece where he says the only question about President Obama is he the most pro-Israel president in American history, or just one of the most pro-Israel presidents? And I suggest to you that the two positions taken by these two columnists reflect a division within the Jewish community.
But again,
Many Jews also are on one side or the other of, do you believe the president or have his policies, has what he done, and one last thing, the president always says very effectively, there's been $3.1 billion of aid. There has never been as wonderful a foreign aid program, and where they're giving the new stealth planes to Israel to make sure, says Panetta, that Israel will retain its air superiority. And at the same time that is done, Bret Stephens is arguing this is a policy that he inherited from the Bush administration, and that what the president really has done is undermine Israel's strength and its ability to act on its own. Those are the two things I hear all the time.
But I think both of them are wrong. I think both Stevens and Friedman are wrong.
Tell us why.
I don't believe to say the president has been the best friend of Israel, I think is absurd on the one hand. And also to say that there's, in effect, nothing the president said is to be believed is also absurd. And again, I think both of them trivialize the depth of the problem we face. Because if it were only that kind of a thing, I would feel actually a little bit better about it. But the depth of the problem we face, as I've said a few times here, has to go with fundamental views. Listen, Romney wrote a piece the other day. I'm reading the piece and I figure, well, Romney's going to, and he starts off by citing Ronald Reagan. When Ronald Reagan came into office, he said the first day he threatened the Iranians, and in a few days they let the hostages go. And so I figure he's going to say, when I become president, I'm going to announce the first day, if Iran doesn't give up its nuclear thing, I'm going to bomb them back to the Stone Age. He didn't do that at all. If you read the piece, it sounds very much like President Obama on these issues. And the point is, again, to personalize this, the United States has a lot of things to consider. I think we should build on the positive instead of just being cynical and simply say, look how far the president has come on issues that he wasn't before. He said, I am not going to have a policy of containment. Let's go with that. He said Israel has the right to do it. Let's go with that. Now, again, the other things as well. But on the other hand, I'm not ignoring, as I said earlier, the fact is there is a gap, and it's reflected in the comments the president made. And so I think that the Prime Minister of Israel should build, as I think he's been doing in his public statements, in effect to say, these are the things the president has said to me. He recognizes that we have a basic interest to defend ourselves. And if we have to do it, we are going to do it. And I think that's the way Netanyahu chose to walk away from these meetings, to say, I believe that I have the national interest of Israel, and I don't hear anything particularly from the president that's going to stop me, even though the president is saying, don't rush to do it. So.
Yeah. By the way, I think some of the emails that go out reflect that kind of that dichotomy in thinking, and they're toxic, some of them. And I think they're toxic in different ways. To say this is the worst president, this is the best president, what does that mean? I don't know what that means. I think we have to look at the merits of the argument, the particulars of the argument, argue it point by point. There are some people who there isn't anything that anyone's going to say to convince them that he's good. Right. And the other side, there are anyone who's going to convince them that he's bad, right?
If Bret Stephens was here, what would you say to Bret?
I'd say, Bret, let's look at I judge a person. My mother, when I came home from school and she said, how was school? I said, okay, she said, let me see your report card. I want to see your report card. Then I'll know. I think it was Jackie Mason's when he goes to a doctor, I don't just want to see a diploma, I want to see the report card. Tell me how you did specifically in these areas. Let's look at the report card. Let's look at what people have done in certain areas and then base it on that, not on, these generalities or these sentimental kinds of expressions that do nothing.
Yes, but Joe, what you're saying then is the test is whether people think they can rely on what certain people say and what they expect and what they expect them to do in the light of what they say. And no two people are going to come away with exactly the same frequency of understanding. There are some people who believe, for example, I've heard the president criticized on why Israel shouldn't attack prematurely. The main reason was it would upset the oil market and gas might go to $9 or $10 a gallon, and that would be bad for the economy. Now, that may be true, but there are people who would say, well, that's a good reason for not doing it. There are others who will say, how can he put the geopolitical issues in such crass economic terms in a short term? You can disagree on that. Some people will say that's right on, don't bomb. Others will say, no, isn't it more important to look at the lives that would be lost or the lives that would be saved?
And you would
and
say?
it's what you might
And
expect.
what would you say?
What would I say?
Yeah.
Well, I think I said what I said earlier, namely that the issue is ambiguity. Sanctions haven't worked, and there's no reason to think that sanctions will work because of the fissures, because of the emptiness of the sanctions. There are ways around them, and in the meantime, like walking to Jerusalem, you take it step by step. The Iranians are going, they're thumbing their nose at us in every single way, arrogantly, and they're continuing step by step. It is only when they come to understand that the Americans mean what they say, understand and believe that the Americans mean what they say, that they're likely to stop. Why countenance them continuing to enrich and make centrifuges and enrich uranium? That's the only reason they're doing it is for a bomb. We should stop and say to them, stop tomorrow, and if you don't, expect a bomb down your chimney.
Okay.
We haven't done
the president
that.
has not said it.
No.
I saw you nodding in agreement, yes?
On some level, I feel I'm in a very peculiar position here.
How so?
Because I represent an organization where we try desperately not to take
I'm not speaking for any
sides
organization
too
now.
much.
I'd be
Well,
kicked out if I were.
But I think that really one of the problems that we have is exactly that. We are the biggest, the strongest. We are.
America.
Yeah, we don't always act it, but we are. You have Iran over here, and it's exactly like that. Look, I keep nipping away at America, and it keeps looking like I'm not here, and I'm going to keep going. And because we haven't, as a country, and Obama is the representative now, because we haven't said we are firmly standing with Israel, we're showing it to you, we are acting upon it, Iran, I believe, feels rather comfortable continuing to move along with.
Okay, that would seem to suggest, again, without your becoming partisan, that is a failure of some kind of American foreign policy.
Yes.
Yes. Do you agree with Ken that neither Thomas Friedman nor Bret Stephens are right?
I agree with Ken. Yes, I do. Yes, I do. I just don't think those opinions contribute to a very healthy kind of discussion. You know, the other thing I would talk about is this. I'm talking about saying and doing, where we may have disagreed earlier. Iran didn't just become a problem when Obama took office. It was a problem during the Bush administration. Now, you had President Bush, who made all kinds of representations that were so strongly for Israel, and there was nothing being done to counter Iran.
He had enough tourists.
Well, yeah, because we're in Iraq, right?
But
I
remember when I heard it for the first time from Netanyahu's mouth. I think it was at a GA in Los Angeles 4, 5, 6 years ago. No one was talking about it but he.
Excuse me, we had a trip, Malcolm Hoenlein, I, and a few other representatives went to Moscow in 1998 to meet with Chernomyrdin, the vice president of Russia then, on one issue, the Iran nuclear issue, supporting what Joe said. This was an issue on the agenda now for probably 15 years.
Do you think you asked most American Jews about Iran and nuclear? They heard about this in the 1990s?
But the point is, governments knew about this. Our American governments knew about it. Of course, the Israelis did, and the Russians were involved. So it is an issue that's gone beyond any. But the fact is, we have to look at what the choices are now. There's no point in revisiting that history.
And
the truth is, the sanctions regime has increased dramatically over the last year. you want to give credit to whom, to this, the fact, but the question always is a race going on. And it seems to some extent, as Prosor, the ambassador of Israel the other day said, there's an express track of Iran building a nuclear weapon, and there's a local track of the sanctions regime. Now, whether that's completely accurate, because I think the sanctions regime have picked up, but the challenge is, can sanctions work fast enough to stop Iran from reaching that?
What's your instinct?
And my instinct is, no, I don't think so. But if there's any chance, and I think that's the most important first step, the administration has to push for much, much harsher sanctions immediately and not wait till July.
I think the Israelis would hope that sanctions work.
Of course.
Absolutely.
We all do.
Go to war.
We all do.
Who wants to go to war? Right.
We all hope.
Right.
But there's
it's
a
a last resort.
There isn't a long
But the
time
question is,
frame now.
at
When?
what point
When?
have we reached
Exactly.
that point?
That's right.
And that's been really the discussion. All right, I want to ask one more question before we have to wrap up. There is an argument that of late, Israel has been politicized as it has not been politicized in the past. And the criticism is leveled at the Republicans for politicizing this.
What do you mean?
Israel and America.
Yes,
What do you
the
mean?
argument is that, in essence, the American administration has not been good on Israel as a way to convince Jews to vote Republican instead of Democrat. That's the charge. I want to know the extent to which you believe that's true. Is this a new kind of, is this something new on the American scene, or is there nothing new here?
I think the Middle East is legitimate. There's a legitimate issue to discuss. And if I don't like what someone else is saying, all of a sudden it's politicized. You know, that to me is a way of keeping someone on the defensive. It is an area for ripe for discussion, for debate. I don't think we politicize. I'll tell you this.
The argument at AIPAC says this is a bipartisan issue. When it comes to Israel, it's one of the only bipartisan issues, and that Jews should not make Israel
yes and no.
into a partisan
what does that
issue.
mean? What does that mean? We agree on everything? Both sides agree on...
That both Democrats and Republicans believe America should be supportive of Israel.
And I think that's, and I
Fine,
think that
but
remains
what does that
true.
mean? That's a
You're
great
painting
statement.
it too broad a
Yeah,
brush.
I think
what do you mean by that?
no, I think it remains true that both Republicans and Democrats want America to support Israel. There's a difference between that and saying whether someone can be critical of the other party's views on Israel, which of course is going to happen in a political game. That does not negate the possibility of each party trying to work to make sure that everybody supports
And
Israel.
I don't disagree with you. I just want to make sure I'm testing you as best
Well,
I can.
I can.
Here's what happens. AIPAC makes a statement at the beginning of its policy conference. We have bipartisan support of Israel, and that's the context in which the discussions of this 3-day conference are going to be held. They then hold their first panel discussion, and Liz Cheney, who is the daughter of Dick Cheney, injects a virulent anti-Obama tirade, where she basically says, we must change the regime because you have a president here who has done less to support Israel than any other president. The room sort of gasps, and the room applauds, both at the same time, because there are people there who are really upset with the Obama administration, profoundly upset, and there are other people who feel it's an inappropriate comment to make. And there was a pro-Democrat on the panel, Jane Harmon, who says, we're not here to talk about that.
Right.
And she gets applause, not as much as Cheney gets. And Liz Cheney says it a second time. And many people left the room uncomfortable that had been done in an AIPAC meeting. Now, I'm only saying I'm not arguing one way or the other. I'm just asking
So
you.
I'm just simply saying it operates in two dimensions, and you can't, there's no way to prevent, on the one hand, the goal should be to have bipartisan support for Israel as much as possible. That's been the beauty of the work we've done.
In Israel, you have bipartisan support, and then they continue to go
but
at
on
each
the
other.
other hand, especially in an election year, and especially when, after all, especially when you talk about Jewish Republicans, they have one issue that they really believe they have the biggest chance to win. The votes of the Jewish community for Obama was 78% for the Democrats. If the Republicans have any significant chance, they believe, it's on the issue. So one is not going to be able to stifle, and I don't know that one should, efforts by Republicans in order to do that. But having said that, you should keep the goal of trying to maintain bipartisan
What's your
support.
sense, your coalition?
Ken is right. The Jewish vote for Obama was 78%. Even after the worst of times, when Obama received the most criticism, it went down to 68%. So it's a little over optimistic to think that American Jews are going to all of a sudden switch. Well, on the other hand, I think any effort to tell people that you can't discuss Israel in political terms, any effort to say the Republicans and the Democrats should avoid Israel as an issue because it shouldn't divide us on that subject, each side hopes to get an advantage that maybe by they're getting an advantage by not talking about it.
Is it possible?
This is America. You shouldn't try to discourage it. The more discussion there can be on those issues, the better. And the more understanding we have about each other, the finer is our democracy.
Is it possible?
With a little civility.
Is it possible?
Included.
With civility.
That a
Civility,
discussion,
I
hold
believe
on now. Is it possible that a discussion like this is appropriate at this table on Shalom TV, but is not appropriate in the halls of AIPAC?
I think those
No.
I think those discussions
don't-
go on in the halls of AIPAC.
Since when are Jews, in particular, afraid to have heated discussions? Going back
Because
to Talmudic times.
AIPAC's argument is
No,
that's not our role. Our role is not to debate whether a given administration's policies are right or wrong. Our role is to show the American administration the unified support of the
But
state of
look
Israel.
what AIPAC does, and very successfully. It is able to bring in a wide range of participants who have different views. That's the statement, that in this room, right, we can have Liz Cheney, you know, we can have Susan Rice, we can have all these people taking diverse positions, and we can still be in the same room. Doesn't that speak to the greatness of America, as you have in Israel as well?
Look, AIPAC is not Democratic, and AIPAC is not Republican, and AIPAC's rigid rule is they do nothing in what they do to influence the views of their attendees.
Correct.
For Republicans or Democrats. They are only issue-oriented. They want to talk about it and let the chips fall where they may. But
And that's appropriate for them.
And that is appropriate.
That is the
for them.
right
That's
thing
it.
to do.
But they can't stop people, and they shouldn't be stopping people who have views from expressing views. Whether the tone of it, to me, it's the tone of it as well, or the lack of civility.
I think-
Make a point without having to personalize, without having
I
to
think it
call
would be
names.
important at AIPAC, you know, to state, we believe Israel, and then go into detail. I think it's very, very important that we recognize, as Ken said earlier, there's an objective here. We all have strong support, but what that means for different people is something else.
I've run out of time. I could go on. This was the fastest hour I've ever had in my life. I can't thank the four of you enough. We just sort of scratched the surface, so we'll have to do it again. But Ken and Joe and Ken and Marcie, it's just so nice of you to have done this. I appreciate all of your insight, and I thank you for spending time with us on Shalom TV. Thank you very, very, very much. And that was our LChayim Roundtable with Ken Jacobson, Marcie Natan, Kenneth Bialkin, and Joe Potasnik. We hope you found their comments thought-provoking. Of course, as always, we'd love to know your thinking. Where do you believe the red line should be drawn? And do you believe there will be a military strike against Iran this calendar year? Please be in touch with us this week. Email me, write me, post on our Facebook wall, or tweet me. I look forward to hearing from you. My thanks this week to B'nai Zion of Manhattan for their help in this LChayim Roundtable. Until the next time, I'm Mark Golub. Be well, my friends.
We would be pleased to send a complimentary DVD of this program to anyone who wishes to support Shalom TV with a tax-deductible gift of $36, double high or more, to the nonprofit organization Jewish Education in Media. Simply visit the Shalom TV website homepage and click on the Donate button to make a donation by PayPal or your credit card. And please indicate the program for which you would like a DVD. Or you can send your tax-deductible check made out to GEM, Post Office Box 180, Riverdale Station, Bronx, New York 10471. And again, please remember to indicate which program you would like to receive on DVD with our compliments. And we thank you for your kind support.
LChayim is a presentation of Jewish education in media.